Okay, here we go. So Chris, welcome to the Q&A session, QC/QCCC. Your paper was excellent, and the video that you posted has already been seen by over 600 people, which is significantly more than would see you in Lodge, which is rather nice.
Absolutely, yes.
So a quick introduction. Chris has been a member of QC Lodge for some time. He is a prolific writer and researcher and covers a wide spectrum of subject matter. In my year in the chair, I was delighted to have him speak on Freemasonry and Catholicism, which was one of the more contentious issues, I guess, that's been discussed within QC Lodge over the last few years and generated considerable discussion both in Lodge and subsequently. It's a subject I hope that he and we can return to in due course. But this afternoon's discussion is on the origins of the third degree, and Chris puts forward some very interesting propositions, some of which I agree with, some of which I don't. But Chris, would you like to just summarize your position over the next 5 or 10 minutes? We can then go straight into the questions.
Okay, Rick, yes, thank you for the introduction. The paper really falls essentially into 3 parts, one could say, really. The first part is to assemble together in one place the primary source material that is currently available, certainly that's what's known to me. And the reason I've done that is because it's a very important topic, the origin of the third degree, and the information is scattered among many documents and is often a scrap here and a scrap there. And it seems to me it'd be very useful if one put into one place all the scraps of material so that one could have a bit of a look at it afresh and see if any particular story emerges. And that brings me to the second part, because obviously, as you know, as any historian does, an historian is an interpreter of facts, not a collector of facts. Many people seem to think that historians collect facts. That's not what historians do. Historians interpret facts. They take primary source material, they look at it, and they see what it tells them. And what it tells me, as you've alluded to already, and I pose in the question of the title, is that the man who was behind the third degree was John Théophile des Aiguilliers, the third Grand Master. And certainly the primus inter pares of the members of the lodge for the first 20 years of the existence of the Premier Grand Lodge. And in the paper, you can then see, hopefully, I'm sorry, this is digging for some reason, I've no idea why. One can see that, as I say, I'm suggesting 2 things. First of all, that it seems to me that John Théophile des Aiguilliers was the author of it. And also I'm saying, well, if it's not him, well, then who else is it? Because you are very familiar with the prime people that were around at that time. And so you will know yourself. I mean, you know, the list from that we can choose from. And, you know, it's quite easy to go through that list and cross off an awful lot of names on it. And so I've done that, and I've come to the conclusion I think it's des Aiguilliers. And so
I mean,
that's where my
your conclusion is quite well set out and justified. My concern would be that there is also likely to have been cross-fertilization from Ireland, Scotland, and France. And I just wondered to what extent that has come into your overall sort of consideration.
Right. Okay. Well, yes. Shall I finish? I'll finish the paper first, and then I'll go into your first question, Rick. The third part of the paper, of course, is an appeal to people to look for primary source material. Freemasonry is bedeviled with secondary and tertiary sources, people who look at secondary material and then reassemble it into tertiary material and so on, rather than going back to primary source material. And it seems to me that the primary mission of the lodge is to keep people focused on primary source material. And I'm sure there must be an awful lot more out there that is just, we'll call it mislaid, but it's not lost. I mean, you think there were about 150 lodges in 1736. Now, they were all keeping minutes, they were all keeping records, and yet we've got a handful only extant at the moment. So it's a sort of appeal to people just to go looking, and I suggest in the talk that I gave about the paper, places where people might like to go and look. To come to your first question, as it were, what is the influence of outer? Well, there's no influence from France for certain, because Freemasonry went from England to France, and it wasn't, it was only just about to be in France at the time we're talking about, in 1725, 36, 26. Scotland is a more interesting case. I don't think in the case of the third degree there is any Scottish influence at all. In fact, it's pretty clear that it went from London to Scotland. And in fact, it didn't actually take off in Scotland terribly well, as you know. I mean, I don't know if Bob Cooper's a member of our lodge, who's a Scottish Mason, well-known Scottish Mason. And if Bob is listening to this or watching this, he will be confirming that it was not until the end of the 18th century that all the lodges in Scotland worked the third degree at all. But nevertheless, there were ones that certainly came in at an early date, and I do refer to those, of course, in the paper of the lodge in 1726, which means, of course, that there were people in 1725, because that they were initiating people or raising people in January of 1726, so they must have been themselves a bit earlier than that. So it's 1725, isn't it? But I don't see anything earlier in Scotland that is influencing, of course, say Des Aguliers, that's my argument. And Ireland likewise. I mean, the Grand Lodge, Irish Masonry seems to me to more or less start in 1725 with the creation of the Grand Lodge of Ireland. Again, an awful lot of English Masons going to Ireland and so on. So no, I don't think there's any influence. In fact, I think the reverse. And that is that Freemasonry, as it had been established in, we'll say, the 1720s in London and Westminster, went out from there. It went over to the United States, to Georgia and places like that. You know that more than me. It certainly went to France, it went to Spain, it went to Lisbon in Portugal, it went to the Netherlands. And in fact, most of these, the lodges coming in, most of them are in fact pupils of Des Aguliers or associates of Des Aguliers. I mean, the first lodge that was set up in Lisbon, this is, I think the Custos one was the third lodge, wasn't it? But the first one was, again, Des Aguliers people who'd done it. Des Aguliers himself, you know, as you know, held a lodge in The Hague. The members of Lodge 4 went over to Paris 2 or 3 times. The Duke set himself up a lodge in his grandmother's home in Aubigny, which I wish we knew more about, actually, but we don't. So I think very much that this is starting in London and going out from London.
Well, just to assuage the ire of any Scot or Irishman who's listening in or who might look at it later, I think we should state that what we're talking about as Freemasonry here is the Enlightenment Freemasonry that followed the creation of the first Grand Lodge, rather than other forms of Freemasonry that did exist in Ireland.
Absolutely.
So what to me is interesting is that Des Aguliers, from my research, took an organization. When I say he took it, George Payne, the Duke of Richmond, the Inner Circle at the Horn, and a few others, took an organization, Freemasonry, remolded it into an Enlightenment force, but at the same time, rather than just staying with the existing 2 degrees that were in place, developed it further.
Oh,
Now that
absolutely.
is interesting.
Oh, I mean,
Why would they do that? What's the purpose in that?
I mean, the changes are not just, I mean, they add degrees, as we're talking about today, the third degree and the Scots Master, which developed into what we call the Royal Arch. We have lectures coming into lodges. We have des Aiguilles floor cloths, we call them, you know, our tracing boards, for example. I'll talk about them probably a bit later. But I mean, that's a des Aiguilles invention. He was involved in the design of the aprons for the Grand Masters. He was involved, and they were involved in setting up of the Grand Charity. They had the stewards were set up at this sort of time and revived. I mean, there were massive changes, and you're absolutely right about that. I mean, masonry, and it was all going on in this time from, what will we say, about 1716, 1717 through really probably to about 1740. And pretty well everyone that was a key player, with I suppose the one exception of Anthony Sayer, who was the compromised candidate as the first Grand Master from another lodge, all of those other members were all members of the Horn Lodge, all of them. You know, the first secretary of the Grand Lodge was William Cooper. The first treasurer was Blackerby. You know all this, Rick, as well as I do. But the changes were enormous. And other changes that are quite interesting is actually the whole idea of meeting regularly in a fixed place. You know, before that, in the old system, it was more a question of let's have a meeting because we've got to initiate or pass somebody or whatever. But this is a total change. In fact, actually, I did put one or two things beside me here that I could show people while I was looking at, because you know I'm keen on artifacts, so I'm keen. And this is something I know that nobody will have seen, so I can show you this here. It looks huge because I'm just showing it to you, right? You can easily, nicely put it in your pocket. It's really neat. Put it in your waistcoat pocket or something. And then it's got a little thing like this, and you see, you pull it out like so, and then you open it up. And here we have, I think we see, there we are. There's the very first engraved list of lodges from March 1723. And this is, in a way, a very good illustration of a historical method, in a way, because you look at this, you say, well, that's really useful because I've got a list of the lodges that existed in London and Westminster in 1723, and it tells me where they meet. So let's assume here we are, we're on the third Thursday, aren't we? Third Thursday of the month. And I remember when
I'm going to do, Chris, I'm going to share screen. Okay, here, you can talk over it, but I'm going to share screen because I have a picture of that, which is much larger.
Oh, good, well done.
Which then
right.
people can actually see. So is the share screen?
Yes.
You see that? Excellent.
Well, actually,
so
can you roll it up and go to the last page?
Yes, yep. So, this one here.
No, go down again, because these are flattened out on the. So the last page is that the last? Yes, here we go. Now then, if everybody looks at the left-hand side, which is actually the last page of the thing, and you look at the top, very top one there, you can see that it says that on the third Thursday in every month, which is there. And the picture there is of George and the Dragon. So at the George and the Dragon pub in Charing Cross, which is next door to it, is the Masonic meeting. So if I have my little list that I've got here in my pocket, of course, I can then go and visit. And this is perhaps the most significant thing about this list. It's not just that it tells us the names of the lodges. If we compare it with the next one, then we can see the lodges that have folded and the lodges that have been created. But much more important than that, I think, historically, is that it exists at all and why it exists. And this exists. It was made by George Payne, and it was sold to him to make a few bob. You know, I think he wanted to make a few bit of bob with it. But what it tells us is that early Masons were encouraged to visit. And I would say to any Mason that's watching this, and I repeat it more or less every time I give a talk in Masonry, is that the best form of Masonic education is visiting. Go and visit. Go to other lodges, go to other constitutions. It's a terrific educational experience. And this is what these this is what they're saying in this little 1723 lodge list that you pop in your pocket. It meant, you know, I could today, if I were using this literally, if I were in 1723, I could say, oh, I think I'll go to lodge tonight. Oh, look, here it is. It's at the George and Dragon in Charing Cross. I'll pop along there. And that's new, Rick, isn't it? That's new.
That is new. That is new. And it's absolutely fascinating. Hang on, I can't minimize. Okay, there we go. Yes, I apologize, as I said at the start, for any errors in this particular program as I find my way around the screen. You are absolutely right. This is a seminal period in not just in Grand Lodge, but in Freemasonry, and not just in Freemasonry in London, but as it begins to spin out into the provinces and overseas. And the role of the Horn Tavern, of the senior members of the Horn Tavern, and their motivation for driving this forward is actually one of the most interesting aspects of Freemasonry at this time. But to go back to the issues at hand, we have a number of questions, and I'm going to start with one of them. Do you think, Chris, that the 3-degree craft masonry might have drawn some inspiration from the Companions in France? They have a structure of a 3-degree tier system. I know what you're going to say, but say it anyway.
Well, I'm going to say that the answer is no. There's no more of a connection with the Companionage in France and Freemasonry than there is with the Knights Templar of the Crusades and the Masonic Knights Templar movement. And there are reasons for this. If we think about the Companionage, which still exists today, incidentally, although nowadays it's not very big, and it tends to be woodworkers actually now. But the original Companionage, of course, covered all crafts. I mean, it was blacksmiths as well as masons and carpenters and a whole long list of all artisans. It has similarity with Masons in the sense you say 3 degrees. It has similarity with Masons in the sense it's all male, but that's about where it stops. It covered the whole range of craft skills. And there is, of course, one of its key features is the famous Tour de France, the Tour of France, from which, of course, the famous cycle race gets its origins. But there, and it still applies today, that if you want to be a companion, you have to spend 6 months in a series of different places in France in order to develop your knowledge of the skills of the different areas of France. Now, with Freemasonry, as you know, the Freemason was taken on by a master, and he stayed with that master. Freemasons moved in order to get work after they were qualified. Companions travel in order to become qualified. It's a different thing altogether. The
main issue.
Sorry.
I mean, the main issue here is that the structure might appear similar, but the content.
Oh no, absolutely. But there's even something two even more significant differences. That the Freemasonry, of course, has, as we were talking about, a speculative side, and Companionage does not, and that's a major difference. But the most significant difference of all is that the Companionage has always, and even in the Middle Ages that we're talking about then, been outside the church, in very often, in fact, opposed to the church. Whereas Freemasonry, even today, is fundamentally a moral organization within the context of Christianity. And that is a major, major difference. So no, go back to the question. The answer to the question is no, there isn't. there's no link really, apart from the most superficial, namely an all-male organization that has 3 degrees.
There's a second question. What would you say to those who push the narrative that the Hiramic legend was a substitute for the Noahite legend, that that it was appropriate to replace Noah with Hiram, since a skilled mason fitted into the scheme of Solomon's temple, and the lesson of death in the 3rd degree?
Well, this takes us, of course, to the realms of the Graham manuscript.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now,
Absolutely. Which we have
you know,
looked
in a
at.
way, it's almost a story on its own. Let's just explore that for a minute. I spent a lot of time talking to the late brother John Acaster over lunch about this matter, because John was a great promulgator of the Graham manuscript and thought it was extremely important. My view is quite the reverse, and I think it is fairly overblown and actually of very little significance, and I'll explain why. When we look at the Graham manuscript, the first thing is the date of it. Now, again, another past master of the lodge, the late Neville Barker Cryer, put forward the argument that the date that's written on it, 1726, was actually the numbers should have been put in a different way, and it was 1672. Well, that is nonsense, because the fact is the actual paper it's written on has a watermark and it's 18th century. So that's the end of that discussion. Dear John Acaster wanted, again, Masons have this idea, they always want things to be older than they really are. And his argument he put forward was, well, it's only a copy of something much older. Yeah. Well, that falls down at the first hurdle, because if you look at it, you will find that the author, and I'll come on to him in a minute, Thomas Graham, that he actually quotes from and refers to material that was actually produced in the 1720s. So it can't be earlier than the material that he quotes from. So the date is definitely 1726. And if it's a copy, it's still a copy of something done in 1726. And then we come on to Thomas Graham himself. Well, I don't think his name was Thomas Graham even. I think Thomas Graham were his Christian names and his real surname was Chancing. Because you can read it two ways. You either read it, he was either a chancing master, which is chancing being an adjective of master, or you say he was Thomas Graham Chancing, master of lodges, whichever way you read it. I read it the second way, but it doesn't matter. We'll call it the Graham manuscript because that's what people call it. But he's rather interesting because he is unique to the manuscript. I mean, we've got quite a lot of lodge lists of that period, not only in York, because we know he was in York, but also, you know, up in Gateshead and Newcastle and so on. His name does not appear anywhere. We can't find it at all. Whether it's Thomas Graham or Thomas Chancing, it's not there. So that's another issue of it. But the third and much more important thing, and I'm coming now on to the whole business of the raising of Noah by his sons, which is what is being referred to in the question. About 10 years ago, I thought, I'm going to get to the bottom of this. And if you want to get to the bottom of something, go to an expert. And I went to talk to a marvelous researcher called Margaret Barker, Dr. Margaret Barker. And she actually came to Manchester and gave a talk. John Acaster invited, and it was marvelous. Now, Margaret is a great biblical scholar. Rather like the Duke of Sussex. When she was very young, she got hooked on Hebrew. And she's not Jewish, and she said she doesn't know why it was, but she suddenly, as a young girl, got fascinated by Hebrew. And so she learned Hebrew. And then she got interested really in Semitic languages, and she learned Chaldean and Syriac and the other languages. And she's spent the last 50 plus years now studying all the original texts in the original language, which is, of course, why I went to her. And she's not only studied the biblical text, she's studied the rabbinic literature, and she's studied non-biblical text of the period. And so I said to Margaret, I said, well, you know the story and so on, and gave her the thingies and said, what do you know? And she said, I can tell you for certain that this story does not exist anywhere apart from in the Graham manuscript. There is one slight thing that could be related to it, which is in one of the early texts of the book of Enoch. Enoch's, it's actually written in code. And if you translate the code, it's a story of Noah becoming an angel and so on. although it's actually dressed up as a white bull becoming a man in the code, as it were. But she says, even if Thomas Graham had known it, and he couldn't have known it, but had he known it, he wouldn't have understood it. But since the manuscript was only discovered at the end of the 18th century, he could not have known it. So what we can say is that this story in the Graham manuscript is completely unique to that manuscript. And you as an historian, as me an historian, immediately see flashing red lights. What I think the explanation...
Go on, please.
Oh yeah, I was going to say, what I would say is this. Thomas Graham decided to write down, and he was obviously promulgating his knowledge of Freemasonry and what he'd read and so on, and it's in the manuscript. And I think that he had heard that 1726, just after the beginnings of the Third Degree, I think he'd heard about it in London, from London, possibly from Edinburgh. He's in York, he's sort of, north of him and south of him as well. But I don't think he knew what it was actually about. And I think he thought, oh, it's something to do with, the death of somebody and the raising of somebody. And he took this idea of Noachites, of course, or Noachidae, however you like to, which word you like to use, which only comes and was only used because of the legendary history going back to Noah being the first Mason and so on. And he thought, it must be something to do with that. Well, perhaps it's raising of Noah by his sons. And he invented it. And I think this story has nothing. I think what it is exactly the opposite of what the questioner is suggesting. I don't think that the Hiramic legend was adapted from the Noah legend. I think the Noah legend was made up by somebody who'd heard about the Hiramic legend but didn't actually know the details and got it wrong. Sorry, there's a bit of a long answer, Rick, but anyway, there you go.
There was a lot of stuff made up at the time. Moving on to another question. So you say in your paper that the prime mover behind Grand Lodge was George Payne. Now, I personally think that that's incorrect. I see George Payne as one of a triumvirate, if not more. I would certainly, as we were talking about at the start, I would certainly put into the mix our friend Desagoulier. We have the Duke of Richmond, who is far more than just a figurehead. We have a whole mass of other and so on and so forth. Why do you put so much emphasis behind George Payne? I mean, other than to say he was an administrator and he did provide the structure, but would you really see him as a prime mover?
Oh, I think he's definitely a prime mover. I think you're agreeing he's a prime mover. It's just, I agree with you, actually. I don't think he's the one person. I think he is the most likely of the group you've mentioned, and they are all key figures in this. There's no doubt about that at all. I think he's most likely to be the one that would have seen the advantage of having a formal structure with regulations, simply because of his own background and his own job. If you look at whether you're looking at Desagoulier or you're looking at the Duke of Richmond or you're looking at William Cooper, or I can't remember the other people that you mentioned, again, they're all very much key figures in it. There's no doubt about that. But my feeling is that if you like, the person that's likely to have who have been the first person to say, look, I think we need a structure for this. This is expanding, this is taking off. I think we need a structure, and I think it's George Payne. And as you know, he does two things, doesn't he? The first thing he does is he writes the regulations approved in 1721, as you know. The second thing he does, of course, is he asks for all the old manuscripts in, which of course had a plus and a minus with it, because you've got the Masons that said, here's our old manuscript, and the other Masons said, I'm burning our manuscripts, we're not sending those buggers in London. So we lost material as well. But no, I think he's primus inter pares. I'm not saying any more than that. The others are very significant, yes, and not least the Duke of Richmond, whose father was a Mason, of course, the generation before.
We have some questions from the audience currently watching, one asking for your comments on Newton's influence on Desagoulier with respect to the work done in Grand Lodge and the degrees.
Oh, I think
what influence?
Newton is, Newton's influence on Des Egouliers, vice versa, that is all to do with the Royal Society, it's to do with science and so on. Newton was definitely not a Freemason. He wouldn't have even been interested in Freemasonry. He was not a very sociable guy at all, Newton. And in fact, he wasn't a terribly nice person, actually. He was very interested in Solomon's Temple. He was very interested in alchemy. But the Des Egouliers and his relationship to Newton is all to do with him. Des Egouliers was a brilliant lecturer. He was a brilliant lecturer. And when you've got any new ideas, if you want them promulgated, you need a good lecturer. And Des Egouliers was, in a sense, the mouthpiece, the person who could explain Newtonianism to lay people, we'll say. And that happens in other things. You take geology at the beginning of the 19th century. You've got a brilliant man like Conybeare, who is doing marvelous work. But you need this extrovert William Buckland, who's fascinating everybody and is convincing all the students it's wonderful and marvelous and super. So I think that's the relationship between them. The one is, if you like, the superintelligence who is writing the Principia, and the other is the person that understands the Principia but can explain it to lesser mortals, and that's that. But no connection Masonically, no.
I think that's a very good point. That in Des Egouliers' own words, he comments very strongly that the best way to educate is to entertain, and he conflates the two. And this is absolutely right. Whether it's in an academic environment or whether it's in a lodge environment. And I'm again looking at a question that's been posted. That you made mention that Des Egouliers understood the power of visual presentation over words themselves. And what he did was to provide that composite, that it was entertainment in lodge. That was how you inculcated what was being said, whether you were inculcating Freemasonry or whether you were doing it with respect to Newtonian theories. And actually we see that. Well, we see that. We see that at Aubigny too. You mentioned the letter from Thomas Hill to Richmond, where Des Egouliers talks about making his presentation, making his production more flamboyant, more historically appealing to his audience.
Yes, when he's aging up the warrant. Yes, yeah. Oh yes. That's. But Desi, as he's called, they used to call him Desi. It's very interesting, actually, as you know, the Duke of Richmond and President Montagu were very good friends, and they corresponded, and they liked Desi. They used to call him Desi, and they liked it. I'm not sure they didn't call him that to his face, but they used to call him, and sometimes they call him Dr. Desi's, sometimes they call him, but they admired his ability, they admired his terrific amount of work, but he was a short man and he was rather plump and he was terribly pompous and all sorts of things like that. So they found him quite amusing, but they really liked him. Whereas, in fact, interestingly, in a Masonic sense, they really did not like Andrew Michael Ramsay. They really didn't like him at all, as we can tell from the letters and what they said about him behind his back.
Let's just digress. Let's digress for a few seconds, because I think it's actually extremely interesting to look at Ramsay and to look at the impact that he had in France. And he was a suspicious character. And some years ago, I was researching this, and Lord Townsend asked Delafay, his head of the Secret Service, to keep an eye on Ramsay. And isn't it interesting that Ramsay was initiated into Freemasonry in the Horn Law, in the Horn? What better way was there to keep tabs on someone than to admit him to your lodge?
Yeah, and of course, not just there, he was taken into the Royal Society, and of course into the Spalding Gentlemen's Club as well. He went into all three.
Hugely
and they managed to fiddle him a doctorate at Oxford as well, which was quite interesting because, of course, he was a Catholic, and he's the first Catholic to be given an honorary doctorate at Oxford since the Reformation, and he was a Jacobite, and there was a big a serious battle basically at Oxford, and they had a vote at the end, but the vote went in favour, and he got his Doctor of Civil Law. But yeah, Ramsay's an very interesting character, but as you say, he was a bit. Well, the French word that the what's his name now that Montesquieu uses, fad. Yeah, I don't know quite how you translate.
Okay, so
I think bit of a creep. Actually, I think it's the best way to put it. Yeah,
bit of a creep. We have a question. To what extent was Desaguliers a Rosicrucian? Again, I know what you're going to say, but I'll let you say it.
No, not at all. Not at all. No. No, I mean, I can't really, I can't expand on that, because the answer is just simply no. He was nothing to do with it. No.
I think that's absolutely right. No, that's completely correct. Let me look at some of the other questions that we've got here. So yes, now you make the point that the occasional lodge formed at the home of the British ambassador at The Hague was opportunistic.
Oh, I'm sure.
I would disagree completely. I would disagree completely. I would see that as being planned. He was the Duke of Lorraine was known to be coming to The Hague. The secretary to Ambassador Chesterfield had corresponded with London, not only telling London that he was coming, but making sure that London knew that he was favourable, was a great admirer. But in fact, I can quote. He passed on the intelligence that Lorraine professes himself a great admirer and friend of the English nation, and is learning the English tongue with such an application that he carries an English grammar in his pocket. And I would argue that this intelligence encouraged Townsend and Desaguliers to form that lodge. Not that it was opportunistic, it was done on the day because the chap was attending a lecture, but it was planned, it was pre-planned, it had been planned for some time, in exactly the same way that the Duke of Lorraine's raising at Walpole's Houghton Hall was planned.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes. I mean, well, I sort of agree with you and sort of don't agree with you, in the sense that what I'm saying is that the original plan was for the Duke of Lorraine to go to London, and that's absolutely right. But he sort of decided he wanted to listen to the famous Desaguliers' lectures, so he ended up at The Hague. And Desi, being ever the opportunist, that's what I mean is opportunist. He saw the possibility, we must make him a Mason, and he just gathered the people together. And I think when you say Townsend, you mean Chesterfield, don't you? I mean, Chesterfield was a key.
Sorry, I mean Chesterfield. Of course, I mean Chesterfield.
Yeah, so I think Desi was. I mean, I think Desi was really behind. Desi liked the nobility. He liked associating with, the nobility. And of course, it's Desaguliers that, as you know, initiated and passed Duke of Lorraine, who eventually, of course, became Holy Roman Emperor and so on, and very important. It's Desaguliers again with the Prince in 1738, and of course it would have been Desaguliers with Frederick the Great, except that Desaguliers, as you know, suffered very badly from what do you call the stuff you get in your feet?
Gout.
Gout. He's suffered very badly from gout. Couldn't make it. It couldn't go over to Germany. Otherwise, he would have had the hat trick of making Royal Masons, actually, but he wasn't able to, and they had to send, as you know, the Provincial Grand Master of Hamburg to go and do it instead. But I think there's an element of planning, in the sense, certainly it was planned that the Duke of Lorraine was going to London. That was all planned, certainly. I just simply the idea of, in inverted commas, making him a Mason was more on the hoof.
Okay, I will disagree, and I'll put my disagreement in writing.
I'm glad I'm disagreeing with you, Rick, at least on something.
Let's turn to the Scots Masters. Talk about that. Why was that introduced? What was its purpose?
Well, my argument in the paper is that Desaguliers, I think the whole thing starts with this passage that I quote, which was printed in Samuel Lee's Orbis Miraculum, or Solomon's Temple Portrayed in Scripture Light, Now, we know that Daisy Goulier had a copy of it because, as I say in the paper, it turned up on eBay and it's in Carolina now in the States. And I think you can see why any Mason would buy the book, because, you know, Solomon's Temple portrayed in scripture light is, you know, begging for Mason to buy it, isn't it? And I think when Daisy Goulier got near to the end of it, he came across this wonderful story, and being him, he could see that it would just make a marvelous degree. This idea that the discovery of the lost word in the cave, in the original story, a cave, now we talk about a crypt, but in the original story, it's a cave, under Solomon's Temple. And for those that are watching that are Royal Arch Masons, it's almost word for word what we have in the current Royal Arch ceremony of the account by the Principal Sojourner. And I think he could see that that would make a great degree. So that brings us two things. Why have another degree? And the answer to that really is in what we were talking about earlier, namely the whole changes and the expansion. And what we didn't mention then, which we must mention, is the change in the nature of the lodges from being lodges of people within one craft skill to being, like some lodges are now, of people, well, in fact, the Horn Tavern only had one operative mason in it. So if you haven't got this combined common thing, which, you know, if you had a lodge of piano tuners, they'd have lots of things to talk about, you know, the latest device for tuning pianos, wouldn't they? But if you've got, you know, one piano tuner and one, you know, historian and one, you know, whatever, you need more masonry, I'll put it in inverted commas. And so I think the reason that was going behind why to expand the number of degrees, that was to do with the changes in the lodges. And I think then you get this marvelous story, which Daisy Goulier could see would make a degree, but you can't lose it until you've accounted for the loss of the word, because it talks about this discovery again. And I think that was the origin fundamentally of the third degree. So although the third degree is worked before the Scots Master, I think the idea of the Scots Master predated the third degree, and that the story of the death of Hiram and the loss of the word and keeping his obligations unto death and receiving the crown of life and all that, I think that was created in order that later this marvelous story could be used. So that
I would add two things. I would add two things, if I may.
Yeah.
I would add two things. The first is the theatricality. It is a highly theatrical, it's a demonstrative degree. It's appealing. I mean, if you look at the
both of them
rollout, yes. I mean, it just adds to the overall sense of theatricality. It makes the whole event much more appealing to an audience. And when you look at the rollout of the Royal Arch in the second half of the 18th century, this was one of the great drivers behind ancient Freemasonry. It was such an attractive.
I mean, what perhaps I ought to mention, Rick, is for the benefit of people who are watching this, is the difference between the Scots Master and the Royal Arch. Obviously, if you're talking, and one of the biggest problems that comes again in Masonic history is people muddling things up because they don't define things. For example, if you're defining the third degree, you define it in terms of the Hiramic legend. You can't define it in terms of the raising on the 5 points of fellowship, because that existed in the Fellowcraft degree earlier. Now, if you look at the Scots Master degree, what defines it is this story in the discovery in the cave. But the Royal Arch is defined not by that, but also you have that plus the East End, where you have 3 co-equal masters. Obviously, it's not appropriate for us to go into all what that's about now, because we're way away from what we're really talking about. But nevertheless, that's the difference between the Scots Master and the Royal Arch. If you're talking Royal Arch, you're talking the story from the Scots Master, but you're also talking about 3 co-equal masters and the 2 scribes and so on. So I think it's important to, I just wanted to, explain to people that are watching the fundamental difference between those two.
The other driver I have always felt is money, that the secretary of a lodge could charge to add an extra degree, and you see this with Irish Freemasonry in particular.
I was just going to say that if anything motivated the ancients, it was that, wasn't it? I mean, the advantage of being an ancients was you could do all the degrees with one piece of paper. I mean, I really admire. I always think that Lawrence Dermott, was the Alistair Campbell of his age. Really, he was a spinner of things, and he had this wonderful idea. Let's call our lodge the ancients, and we'll call all these actually much older lodge, we'll call them the moderns, and it worked. People actually started to think in those terms. But the other thing, the big selling point was you can make more money with the ancients because you could do all these lodges, and as you know, everybody had to pay an extra subscription for each degree. Yes, oh, absolutely. And the second half of the 18th century is very much the time of the expansion of degrees, isn't it? I mean, we see a huge number of degrees that have been developed in France coming back into England. I mean, the most obvious one being the Rose Croix, of course, which is still used. But oh yeah, you're absolutely right on the money side. Yeah, I'm not sure if that was the motivation back in the 1720s and 30s, but it definitely was in the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. Definitely.
What about the influence that Desaguliers had with the European nobility? I mean, the rollout of Freemasonry in Europe among the elites was considerable. Do you see that again as something that was driven Masonically, or do you see it driven Masonically and politically?
I don't think it was particularly politically, except insofar that people, let's take France for an example. As you know, that while the man who became Louis XV was underage and so on, and even after his majority, he left the running of things to Fleury, Cardinal Fleury. There's no doubt from what Cardinal Fleury writes and so on that he was politically worried about Freemasons because they were a secret organization, and he saw them as being, potentially a problem. They weren't, but he saw them in that term. But that's the only sense in which I think it was political. I think the rollout, and in fact, as you will know from the documents, that there's lots of evidence which is that motivated Fleury and he writes and says, that a lot of the best people, as it were, were joining the Masons, and in that sense it was political, but they were joining it because they were enjoying it just the same way as people were enjoying Freemasonry. Was a fashion at that time. I mean, this huge expansion was fashion, and it motivated people in France just as much as it motivated people in England.
That is absolutely right, but don't you think that there was also an Enlightenment aspect to it? In Europe at this time, there was a great debate going on over the dominance of Newtonianism versus Cartesianism, and over the sort of thrust that Freemasonry was an Enlightenment organization, a relatively, and I emphasize that word, a relatively democratic organization. Lodge members would vote for the officers of the lodge. There would be discussion and debate in lodge. There would be scientific lectures in lodge. There would be activities that would not be at one with an absolute monarchy. So was there not also in the development of lodges in Europe an attempt by Whig politicians, English Whig politicians, to bridge that gap, that political gap, with the more enlightened elites in Europe? And Montesquieu is an obvious candidate for this, but of course there are many others.
I'm not going to go into it now because it would take too long, Rick, but I think probably if we did have a debate about Enlightenment, we would strongly disagree with each other, actually. I'm not a fan of the so-called long 18th century. I'm not a fan of the age of enlightenment. My background, as you know, is in musical history, musicology. And if you look at the arts, in fact, if you look at almost everything, you find that there is a very clear break in 1750. Very big break, major break. between, we'll say, the music of Bach and the music of Mozart. And I see that also in Masonry. You know, I see obviously the importance of, we'll call it 1717, it's a bit earlier, but you know, that'll do. But, you know, I can see the first half, and as you referred to yourself earlier, you know, you talked about the second half of the 18th century. It is, you know, there are things. I mean, when we talk about these terms, periodization and so on, it's only a device, as you know full well, you know, to be helpful. And I don't think Enlightenment is helpful. I see the first half of the 18th century as being the creation of this type of Masonry. You call it Enlightenment Masonry, I'd call it speculative Masonry, although I don't even like that title because the old operative Masons speculated as well, but you know, there we go, we're stuck with it. The second half, and I suppose I'm talking 1750 to 1813, there we have this huge expansion of degrees that we've already referred to. Many dozens of new degrees, of which some have survived, but most have not. And that takes us through to a rationalization, a simplification by the Duke of Sussex. And that is exactly what we would see if we were looking in music and looking at other things. So I do see this break in 1750. I don't see it's helpful to go right back to the long 18th century to 1660 and going on to, although 1813 is obviously the next point. And it's come, of course, but it does make sense, but it makes sense where it's being used. It makes sense in science, basically. It makes a lot of sense in science. Both the long 18th century and Enlightenment, Age of Enlightenment, works in science perfectly, really. I think it's been sort of taken over by Masonry, largely by Margaret Jacobs and et al. I don't think it's helpful. There is a bit of a confusion, of course, politically, because we happen to have 4 Georges, 1, 2, 3, 4. So we tend to lump them together, but they're not together. I mean, the first 2 Georges spoke no English. The George III was terribly English, Farmer George and all this. So well, I see, as I see in musicology, a break in 1750, I see that break too. And I think it's helpful in our understanding of Masonry to look at the first half of the 18th century and the second half, in other words, to, you know, 1717, 1750, then we got 2 Grand Lodges, expansion of degrees going up to 1813, a big reduction then to, you know, the Duke of Sussex trying to rationalize it all, reduce it all, and so on. And I'll stop there because I'm sure you'll want to come back on that. But as I say, I don't view things probably quite the same way as you do.
No, we do disagree. I would certainly see the Enlightenment providing foundations, but I would agree with you that the superstructure changes from time to time. It evolves and develops, but the foundations, I think.
The problem with Masonry is the fact that is the actual use of the word. Yes, Freemasonry is about enlightening people, you know, from darkness into light. And again, I think that's all been part of the bit of the muddle, because where it really comes from is the development of science.
Yes, yes, it is. It's a rationalist approach.
Yeah.
I think that's right. Let's end with one more question. Would you not agree that the ritual of the Royal Arch was restructured in the early 19th century to establish a close relationship with the 3rd degree? What connection can the word inscribed on the plate have with the Mason's word?
You're going to have to repeat that, Rick, because I didn't catch all of that. There's quite a lot in it.
Would you not agree? Would you not agree that the ritual of the Royal Arch was restructured in the early 19th century to establish a close relationship with the 3rd degree? The argument is that this happened in the 19th century, not in the 18th.
No,
and
I don't.
If that is the, well, I know you don't.
No, I don't agree with that at all. In fact, if you look at the changes that occurred in the Royal Arch, actually relatively few changes occurred in the Royal Arch. And even today, if you go to lodges, certainly in England, as you know, things are broadly similar, but you go to Royal Arch chapters and they're hugely different. And that's because with the Lodge of Reconciliation, the lodges generally did send their one person down and paid for him to go down and had the demonstration and came back. And they all said, oh, that's all very interesting, but we'll ignore most of that. And then when they came to the chapter of reconciliation, and they said, we're not paying to go to London again, all that nonsense. And they didn't go, and they just carried on as they've been doing. So there are changes that occur. Certainly the changes, there's the business of the letter T/H developing into the triple Tor, largely because people misunderstood the symbol. And that isn't actually dated from 1735. It actually is about 1720. It first occurs in the Da Costa manuscript, which again, although the paper is 1811, the actual stuff is probably 1820. But before 1823, and is not Brown, as many people think it is. It isn't him, it's before him. But as I said, there are very few changes. I mean, where the changes occur in the Royal Arch is actually around 1760. That's where the Royal Arch begins, as opposed to being the Scots Masters we refer. That's where we see these three co-equal masters, which is very significant, but we won't go into it now, but is highly significant. But the connection between the two is clearly right at the start, and that is in the story. One is talking about the loss of the word, the other's talking about it being found. And what is found, and we still get it in the Royal Arch, is in the Royal Arch we get the Mason word, the real Mason word, as opposed to the substituted secrets, which is on. And the other thing that we also get, of course, in the Royal Arch, because and you only get this, of course, if you go through the three chairs, which are very important in the Royal Arch, is you actually get the pre-Reformation Mason word. Although I'm not sure that everybody knows that. So yes, they are. And I do believe quite profoundly that when Grand Lodge says that the Royal Arch is the second part of the third degree, or rather it includes it, it is absolutely correct. Although so many people say, oh no, it's a fourth degree, fourth ceremony, but it's the second part of the story. It goes back to them. Yeah, okay, Rick. So that's an answer to that question, or my view on that.
I'm going to end by putting John Wade back on. There we are. Perfect. Wonderful. John's back on. So John, we will be posting this to YouTube. We'll send it over to Andreas if we possibly can, so that he can transcribe it. I think we've covered all the questions that have been sent in so far, but if anyone
no, I don't think we have, Rick. I don't think we have. There are a lot of questions that were asked early on in the chat box rather than the Q&A box.
I've been through the chat box, John.
Well, for example,
I've been through
the one from Michael Ramos. You made mention that Desigulier understood the power of visual presentation over the words used by the... What?
Yeah, John, that was covered.
Yeah, Rick, we've covered that one, John.
All right. Okay.
Yeah, that was covered.
I mean, one thing we haven't talked about, Rick, was we haven't talked about artifacts. I think there was a question on artifacts that we're going to...
I'd like to finish on that point then. So are there any artifacts, Chris, that you think can help us understand the early versions of the third degree?
Yeah, I'm very keen.
Have that as
you know, and I showed you this little thing earlier on, and I'm very keen on those. And John knows about this because it's John Field, really, about processions. And in 1741-42, there are very interesting, there were two processions, and there are lovely engravings of them. This isn't, I've got an original, but this isn't an original. This is a fake one I made. I think if I put it, can I just show you what it looks like? It just goes out like this. It's this huge thing that goes.
I've seen that, yeah.
You all know that one. This is the 1742 version. Well, what's interesting in it is this that occurs. I've blown it up, so I hope you can see it a bit, that they are carrying this. Now, what this is, as far as I know, is the earliest illustration of a tracing board. It's carried, I mean, it might be a cloth, we don't really know, but it looks a bit like it's solid actually, but I don't know. And this occurs in both the 1741 and 1742 illustrations, but this is the clearer one. And what it says underneath it is the Master Mason's Lodge.
Right.
And if you can see it, you can actually see quite clearly that there is a coffin, and you can see there's a sprig of acacia at the top of it. Have I got it close enough? Is that better?
Yeah, I can see that.
And you can also see the letters M and B too. Now, you know, any master mason will recognize those bits. And it's interesting to me because Desaguliers, one of his developments, of course, Desaguliers is the man who created floor cloths, which became tracing boards. And that's the earliest one we've got. And that shows what would have been, I don't know whether it placed on the floor or stood at the side of a master mason's lodge at that period as the, I'll call it the illustration, because that's effectively what tracing boards are, of the new third degree and the elements in it. Elements that, as I say, all of us as master masons would know very well even today.
Excellent. Excellent. I think, John, you're on mute.
John's gone mute.
But you're off mute now.
Yeah. Did you also see the question from Fred Sells Jr. at 4:22 in the Q&A? That's an interesting one, I think. If you've not, I don't think we've heard this. I'll just read it. It is my understanding that on the 2nd of February, 1356, at the congregation of the mayor and aldermen before the purification of the Blessed Virgin Mary in the 30th year of the reign of King Edward III, certain articles were ordained touching the trade of masons. Hence the words apprentice, journeyman, and master overseer. The Weavers' Guild originated the 3 degrees whom these articles addressed, not Grandmaster Desaguliers. That was the question or comment.
Yeah, well, the answer to that is there is this endless muddle between master mason, meaning third degree, and it's why I use the word third degree and I don't use master mason.
Yeah.
And how it's there, which is master of a lodge, or master meaning a master craftsman. I mean, yeah. I can go back. I mean, John, we're the same age, so you can go back. That, you know, in our youth, like a printer would be called a master printer.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's because he had gone through his apprenticeship and so on, and he had become a fellow. And I explain in the paper about how this 2-degree structure, of course, still exists in the professions, even in England today.
Yeah.
So if you're a surgeon, you become, when you're a consultant, you're a fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons, and before that, you're a member of the Royal College of Surgeons. That 2-degree structure still exists, with the higher one being fellow, which is what we use in masonry. So it's nothing, it's very important. And that's why, as I say, in the paper, I'm very strict about using 3rd degree and not master mason, because you have to be very careful not to muddle master of a lodge and master mason. Master, because the masters of lodges, and going right the way back to the 14th century, were in Masonic rank fellow crafts.
Yeah, I understand entirely.
Okay.
Good. Rick, we've got, there are 5 or now 6 in the Q&A, but there are many more in the body of the chat. All I'm bothered about is, am I going to be able to get the text of all of that?
Yes, we should be able to get the text of all of that, actually, John.
Yeah, and can we also ask those who are online who are listening into this, if they want their questions to be printed in AQC, and to have an answer from Chris, then they must send them in to me by email, in addition to whatever we've got here on the screen in the chats and the Q&As. That's important.
John, John, you better say by the end of the month, hadn't you? Better.
But by the end of the month, that'd be fine. But I do need to have them, and I will then save them, then typeset it. How on earth I'm going to discuss the dialogue between you and Rick in the questions and answers following your paper, I have no idea.
Oh, I'm sure we'll work on something. But look, just to reiterate, even if you've sent in your questions on the Q&A or the chat, please do send them in as well to editor@quattuorocoronati.com, where John will receive them, just to make absolutely sure that we have them. It's better to be safe than sorry. But we're now over an hour. And I've noticed that we're beginning to lose participants. So I think let's draw a line, let's call a halt, and thank Chris very much for an excellent presentation, and indeed for an excellent paper. I think we've all enjoyed it. So thank you all for attending. And if anyone wants to see this again, or who hasn't seen it, if any of your friends haven't seen it, I'll be posting it onto the QC YouTube channel in the next few hours. So thanks again, everyone.
Yep. Goodbye, everyone.
Right,
Bye-bye.
bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.